I want to welcome you all to the 2018 Daniel Burnham Forum on Big Ideas. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cynthia Bowen, and I'm the president of the American Planning Association. It truly is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this great event and the kickoff of APA's Policy and Advocacy Conference, of which I might note that we are completely sold out. We will also be hosting a record number of planners on the Hill on Tuesday, so I'm really excited about that as well. I would like to extend my sincere thanks and appreciation to our presenting sponsor and Burnham Forum collaborator, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Tonight's program is but one aspect of partnership with Lincoln. APA is pleased to work with them on a range of educational programming, and together we are advancing the state of planning in the United States. Tonight's topic is very timely. Our experts are going to look at the state of practice on the use of value capture for infrastructure investment. Infrastructure has been one of the themes of my presidency. And APA has advanced a range of advocacy, research, and educational work in this critical area. This work includes new principles for infrastructure policy, as well as the continuation of our infrastructure task force. But the issue at the heart of tonight's discussion, how can we afford the infrastructure we need, is so important. There are few issues where the desire and the demand for investment so constantly outstrip the will and the innovation to find the funding. And so finally, that may be changing. I'm really hopeful for the discussions like the one we're going to have tonight will lead to new tools and new leadership. So tonight we're going to focus on the solutions. In fact, finding policy solutions will be something you're going to hear about throughout the conference. Once again, thank you for joining us for this year's Burnham Forum. Now I'd like to invite Anthony Flint from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to the podium to moderate tonight's discussion. Anthony.
Thank you. This is really wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really just have to commend your bravery and courage in actually coming to Washington to talk and think about policy and federal programs that could make our cities better places. It's really extraordinary. And I'm sure the next 2 days are going to be really productive for all of you. What I'd like to do is introduce the topic at kind of a high level and take the big picture framework, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists who will present for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll all have a conversation. Let's see. Just loading up the first slide. All right. So, well, the great urban expansion project of the 21st century surely continues, and we don't need to spend much time in this room reminding everyone about the huge challenges that our cities face. Existing infrastructure is deteriorating, and new infrastructure is critically needed as cities try to plan for the future. There isn't enough affordable housing. Successful urban environments have open space and libraries and good transit that's accessible to all. Planners are up to the task, making big plans or incremental steps sometimes as well. That's okay too. But the challenge remains how to pay for it all. This infamous headline is from going on about 50 years ago now, when New York City was on the brink of bankruptcy. But maintaining good municipal fiscal health has only become more demanding. Cities have been caught in a kind of vice, forced to make some really bad decisions over the last half century, putting off maintenance and investing in new infrastructure, putting off investing in new infrastructure, while trying desperately to deliver basic services to all residents. There's declining federal support, of course, and state aid in many cases, and the property tax, the one stable, sustainable, local source of revenue for metropolitan regions, has been battered in many places by restrictions, backlash, and dysfunction. Then there are, of course, the estimated 1 billion people living in informal settlement currently, projected to continue that upward trajectory, possibly doubling as the world's population grows to urban population grows to 6 billion. A more humane future means safe and affordable housing, clean water, sanitation, and transportation options. We know how to do this, more sustainable and equitable urban development. It'll take good planning, but also a lot of investment. The health of cities has everything to do with infrastructure. Infrastructure supports cities, and we're not doing very well in this regard. In the US, of course, we get a D grade by the American Society of Civil Engineers. We'll need $3.6 trillion in investment just to get roads, bridges, transit, and other critical infrastructure in a state of good repair. That's about 20% of US GDP. A credible infrastructure plan appears to have been eclipsed by other matters at the moment under the current administration. Globally, it's estimated that we'll need as much as $40 trillion to bring existing infrastructure up to snuff and to provide basic services to that burgeoning world population. That is about 2/3 of GDP. Well, our first caveat in this discussion about land value capture is that there is no substitute for government funding and borrowing for infrastructure and affordable housing and the like. But there is a policy that could vastly help if it was implemented as a more standard procedure in cities, and it goes like this. Urban land and private development are made more valuable by public investments and government actions. Zoning and allowable height and density, for example, or a subway line or station nearby. Historically in the US, private landowners and developers have enjoyed this as a kind of a gift or a windfall. But what if you could measure how much that bigger building envelope or subway station actually increased the value of land and property? And ask the private sector for a little something back for all the things that are enabling their success. It turns out we can. The concept is known as land value capture. This is a policy that enables communities to recover and reinvest land value increases that result from public investment and other government actions. Also known as value sharing or sometimes value recovery, it's rooted in the notion that public action should generate public benefit. I dare say value capture is quite well qualified to be considered as a big idea for this august tradition of the Burnham Forum. In my brief remarks here, again, I'd like to provide some background and context and a big picture before hearing from our distinguished panel. It takes a little unpacking, so let's start the tour. Land value capture is in use around the world, from London, where just one example of a project there is Crossrail, to New York City in the form of Hudson Yards, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to Hong Kong, the so-called Rail Plus Property model for funding a great transit system. Let's also drop in on Latin America, because there the experimentation and innovation has been particularly robust. In Brazil, there's a new kind of building permit in place known as a CPAC, translated from the Portuguese as Certificates of Additional Construction Potential. Now, we won't spend much time on this, but we're going to hear more detail about this later, but the basic idea is this. If you own a piece of land and you want to build, you start with a baseline FAR of just 1. You want to build anything bigger, you have to go out and buy the right to do so. The permits are actually auctioned on a stock market, and the city collects the revenue. The proceeds are used to pay for infrastructure and other things, including affordable housing and public parks. In Faria Lima, more than $3 billion was raised to pay for infrastructure improvements. What this does is change the development equation, distributing the profits of redevelopment for the surrounding area, bringing about greater equity and more balanced urban growth with less of the massive gap between the rich and poor that we've seen throughout the urban world. Now, that's just one tool, but it's a good example of how to unlock or harness land values to fund improvements. Land is a commodity in fixed supply. Its value is determined almost entirely by its potential use, and that's framed by the rules that we set in zoning and building codes. Land value capture prompts communities to step back and reconceptualize what it means to own land. And we'll hear more about the legal framework in just a moment. But think about that for a minute. It helps to make clear why value capture isn't really a tax. It's more of a recovery of the public investment that is inherent in development projects. Now, one thing I can also tell you is that this is not a new concept. Indeed, it's very old. In the course of human settlement, going back to ancient times, we see evidence in the construction and maintenance of roads and aqueducts in the Roman Empire. It was used in the Philippines in the 16th century, and in France in the 18th and 19th centuries, including Haussmann's redevelopment of Paris. The Bridge of Commons, pictured here, was built in 1809 in Bogota, Colombia, using a form of a betterment contribution. And fundamentally, the concept goes back to this man, Henry George. Now, you might think, how could a political philosopher active at the end of the 19th century possibly tell us about financing infrastructure and keeping our cities financially healthy in the 21st century? Well, we would argue that sometimes for innovation, you have to go back 100 years. Henry George, of course, wrote Progress and Poverty, a global bestseller when it was published in 1879. George, like Karl Marx, was troubled by the widening gap between the rich and poor in the first Gilded Age. He focused on land and landowners and real estate transaction as one way that an elite group of wealthy people got even wealthier, and they didn't even actually do anything to earn that wealth. They were benefiting from government action, which set the foundation and the context for improvements on property. Henry George's big idea was the land value tax, or single tax on land, where the true value of land, in contrast to improvements on land, is assessed based on its location and what can be built there. Economists recognize this as a very efficient tax. For one thing, if you don't like it, you can't pick up the land and move it elsewhere. It's also a tax virtually free of having the effect of distortion. For example, a gas tax or cigarette tax, theoretically, that can prompt reduction in consumption. The land value tax has been attempted with, granted, mixed results from Hawaii to Pennsylvania, but more recently explored in Connecticut, which has a pilot program aimed at struggling but potentially regenerating legacy cities there, such as Bridgeport and New London. Mayor de Blasio has also proposed what is essentially a land value tax to encourage redevelopment of vacant lots that are being held in speculation in New York City. Voters in Oakland approved a measure very recently to do much the same thing. Nobody wants to pay taxes on land that's not working for them, so they'll either build or sell so someone else can. Value capture is based on a similar concept. Although it's important to point out, we don't want to get too heavily into theory here, but in the absence of a land value tax, actually capturing the revenue works a little differently. If we had a land value tax, technically speaking, we wouldn't need value capture. But the common denominator is the value of land and what creates that value. When government puts in a new transit line, for example, the property that's developed around the stations is hugely profitable. So we can change the entire development paradigm and ask the private sector to help fund the things that are creating that value. Value capture works best when it's structured as part of projects from the start, as in Perth, Western Australia, pictured here, where planners are fine-tuning a mechanism to enable a new light rail line. In New York City, in New York, site of a version of land value capture at Hudson Yards, Governor Andrew Cuomo earlier this year proposed special districts around new subway stations where landowners would make these kinds of contributions. Some might call it a surcharge, but again, it's more of a recovery of the value that the public created or is creating. It's tougher to try to do this after the fact, though the concepts remain the same. Confronted by cost overruns in the proposed Green Line extension through Somerville, Massachusetts, transportation officials have floated the idea that private developers might bear more of the responsibility for stations along the new line. So again, in addition to the $2.5 billion of taxpayer money being invested in the infrastructure itself, there's been a massive rezoning at the largely industrial areas at each stop. Each plan stopped all along the new line in Somerville. Somerville, for those of you not from Massachusetts, might be thought of as the Brooklyn of Boston right now. And so this rezoning has taken place at all of the station stops. The future transit-oriented development is going to be immensely profitable, and it's made possible by the public investment and government actions. The private sector has long since recognized this win-win kind of equation. Federal Realty funded the new Orange Line station at Assembly Square, also in Somerville, and the New Balance company participated in the financing of a commuter rail station in Alston-Brighton. The city of Cambridge followed with a proposal for private developers to be more formally linked to the financing and maintenance of transit service in places like Kendall Square, where the T, as we call it, is such an integral part of the success of the area. The concept of value capture is inherent in many other ways, and many other of the things that you all are actively engaged in. We're all well familiar with inclusionary housing, where a portion of new residential development is required to be affordable. But think about that think about the basis for that request. The government is setting the zoning, the building envelope, so the contribution of affordable housing to the community has that kind of reciprocal character. Indeed, there are many instruments in place across the U.S. that embody the concepts of value capture, even if it's not called value capture. Let's look at just one. It's not a perfect illustration, but business improvement districts. It's the type of thing that's, of course, increasingly common in many of our cities. And it's founded essentially on the principles of value capture. When a park enhances property values all around it, it's not asking for much for the private owners to chip in for maintenance. Land value capture redefines the way that our cities can grow in a more equitable way. A new way of financing the future will create sustainable communities and promote municipal fiscal health. We're all working diligently to fine-tune this policy and support cities in the all-important work of making the valuations and assessments of property value to more precisely track the increases that are associated with public investments. There are ways to do this that are getting better and better. This is a clear pattern of showing the increase in property values along the Washington, D.C. metro line. So I hope that has been a suitably big picture introduction for this Big Ideas Forum. Now we're going to dive into some greater detail. We will hear from Jerry Korngold from New York Law School, covering more on the legal framework and issues of the Constitution and property rights and enabling legislation at the state level. Julie Kim, who joins us from the Stanford Global Projects Center, exploring the state of play of a variety of instruments and mechanisms. And Michael Alexander, director of the Atlanta Regional Commission's Center for Livable Communities, who's going to bring it all home and tell us more about the experience with value capture and its concepts on the ground. Then we're going to have these series of crisp presentations, and then I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for a wide-ranging conversation. So with that, I'd like to invite Julie to come up to the podium, and onward we go. Thank you. Behind you.
I'm happy to be here to contribute to an important dialogue regarding land value capture. I'll drill down a bit more into various tools introduced by Anthony, and I believe the other panelists will add more meat to the discussion with real case examples. Land value capture is an effective policy tool used by local governments to capture some part of land value appreciation to generate revenues for public benefit purposes. Along with land use and zoning, land value capture can be the most powerful policy tool available for local governments to help them become more fiscally self-reliant. Value appreciation to be captured here can be generated both organically by basic supply and demand market dynamics, and by positive public interventions such as infrastructure investments. Depending on the specific tools, taxpayers, property owners, and developers variably share the financial burden. And to make these tools more effective, their use are sometimes accompanied by land use and zoning regulatory incentives. The tools can be both funding, that is, they generate revenues, and for financing, that is, raise money upfront secured by these revenues. Property tax is perhaps the most basic form of land value capture. Tax increment financing, or TIF, is a financing tool linked to property tax that enables capturing upfront the anticipated increase in tax revenues to fund the needed public improvements in a designated area. Under TIF, the property tax rate remains the same. Anticipated land value appreciation, which is assumed to come from the public improvements enabled by TIF financing, is not always guaranteed or substantive. If incremental tax revenue falls short of TIF financing, local government and taxpayers are beholden to any residual liabilities. Use of TIF has become much more prevalent in the US, where 48 states are now allowed to use them. Also, in addition to property tax, the basis for TIF financing has expanded to include other sources such as sales tax, hotel tax, and vehicle license fees. One of the major criticisms of TIF has been that it is over-leveraged because the tax revenue projections are often inflated to justify the upfront financing. In the past, its use has also been overextended because the expert advisory community for TIF is often made up of professionals who have vested interest in the project, the development projects themselves, thus benefiting directly from TIF financing. Special assessments, or also referred to as benefits or betterment assessments, are most traditional land-secured financing dating as far back as medieval Europe. Here, public improvements in specially designated districts are paid by property owners themselves who benefit directly from the improvements. Assessment levied are assumed to be directly proportional to the benefits each owner receives. With the general decline in property tax revenues, the use of special assessments have grown dramatically in the last few decades. They have been used to pay for improvements not only in residential areas, but also in business districts, and increasingly rail transit stations and transit-oriented developments as well. Because assessing specific benefits is more of an art than science, there are currently no standard guidelines in determining assessment amounts or their coverage areas. They can vary greatly from one locality to another and sometimes influenced by the local political climate. For example, sidewalks, storm drains, sewers, and utilities can be linked directly to specific districts, whereas arterial streets, interchanges, schools, parks, and libraries have wider benefits beyond the districts themselves. And whether special districts should pay for these wider benefits have often been debated. With the increasing burden on property owners, the imposition of assessments have often been contested with increasing court actions. Court rulings have generally leaned towards more restrictions, and in some cases, they have required 2/3 voter approvals, no different than regular taxes. In general, the general practice is now that benefits that are assessed must be unique, measurable, and direct, and the burden of proof must reside with the local governments. Developer exactions are financial responsibilities that local governments place upon developers to provide some or all of public improvements necessitated by their development projects. Exactions are directly conditional upon land use entitlements and approvals. The exactions usually take 3 basic forms. Developers can dedicate their land for public use, or they can provide in-kind services or facilities such as extra security or street cleaning. But by far the most common exaction, form of exaction is in lieu fees. There are also 3 basic kind of in lieu fees, the most common being impact fees. Impact fees represent the cost of incremental public service capacity required by new developments, and they can include a wide range of infrastructure improvements and services. The other 2 are linkage fees, which are typically associated with mitigating secondary effects such as affordable housing needs, and finally TEF fees, which basically represent utility connection fees. Use of impact fees have been increasing rapidly in the US. There is, however, shockingly little uniformity in how impact fees are determined due to a widely varying level of concessions offered by the developers that often depending on the local political and economic climate. Because developer exactions are often contested, local governments' ability to collect them have accordingly been determined sometimes by lawsuits and court rulings. In the last 2 or 3 decades, courts have generally leaned in favor of developers. The most critical legal and constitutional issues related to exaction is the regulatory takings concern, which I believe Professor Korngold will articulate further in the next briefing. Developers generally pass on the cost of exactions to property buyers when the real estate cycle is in the upswing, but they assume the cost in the down cycle. Land use and zoning regulations are often used as an incentive to enhance the effectiveness of land value capture tools, in particular for maximizing developer exactions. In the US, zoning changes or upzoning are typically initiated bottom-up by developers based on their project needs. In general, upzoning approval rate is quite high, especially when local master plan is outdated. Zoning changes are also used as a political tool by elected officials to raise funding for political purposes. Among others, there are three important regulatory incentives of note. The first is related to air rights. Local governments often use air rights on publicly owned land for value capture purposes. For example, they transfer unused air rights above railroad tracks and transit stations to private developers, often for free, in exchange for major projects that can create significant new tax revenue base. They can also choose to lease or sell such unused air rights and capture additional value from the lease or sales proceeds. First adopted by New York City in 1968, transfer of development rights, or TDRs, is a form of air right value capture tool that enables transfer of unused rights on historic landmarks and other sensitive areas requiring preservation to areas needing more concentrated developments. For privately owned land, TDRs provide financial relief to property owners by enabling them to sell their latent rights to developers who need additional density elsewhere. The value capture here is anticipated increase in tax revenue as well as exactions from new developers on the receiver's side. Second incentive type is density bonus, which is typically granted to developers in exchange for affordable housing and other public benefits. Finally, vested rights are often used for multi-phase long-term projects to ensure that no land use or zoning changes occur while the development project is being implemented. There are two land value capture tools that are based on negotiated contracts, development agreement, or DA, and community benefits agreement, or CBA. They are designed to provide more flexibility and are voluntary and not mandated. DA is a legally binding contract between one or more developers and local government where the developers provide large upfront funding for public improvements in exchange for the local government granting them the vested rights where the land use and zoning regulation that apply to their projects remain unchanged for the term of the agreement. One of the early successful examples of DA is the Foothill Circulation project in Orange County in California, where a group of 19 developers agreed to provide more than $250 million in funding for public improvements in exchange for the vested right to build their projects. CBA is between one or more developers and local community groups that can be initiated by either parties. In CBA, developers provide specific amenities, often social programs such as small local business set-asides, childcare facilities, and sometimes even affordable housing in exchange for the community's support for the project. Often used in conjunction, DA and CBAs are most effective for large, long-term, multi-phase projects. For developers, by virtue of having DAs and CBAs in place, it becomes much easier for them to secure their financing. The primary concern regarding DAs and CBAs have been their lack of transparency. Also because they are relatively new tools, they have yet to be tested on legal and constitutional grounds. Finally, as Anthony alluded to briefly earlier, when using land value capture tools, local governments have to rely heavily on taxpayers, property owners, and developers to share the financial burden. But as their burdens increase, so has their resistance to use these tools. Over the last decade, the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil has found an ingenious way of engaging private investors in the land value capture equation over and beyond local taxpayers, property owners, and developers. The city created additional land use entitlement by upzoning above the current density and sold these incremental entitlements to private investors in public auctions as a tradable certificate. Each certificate, called CPAC, as Anthony mentioned, entitles the buyer a unit of development space, typically around 10 square feet, that is vested for the term of the certificate. The city used the proceeds from the auctions to pay for affordable housing and infrastructure needs, allowing these improvements to be made early, independent of potential delay in project development, and helping to trigger land value appreciation early. CPAC also enabled market-based approach to assessing the value of incremental density created by the city. Instead of bottom-up, developer-driven upzoning that occurs on a case-by-case basis in the US, Sao Paulo established a top-down upzoning policy tool designed to focus on areas that need redevelopment and also encourage smart growth and TODs. Over the last decade, CPAC enabled Sao Paulo to raise over 15% of their total capital investment needs using less than 0.1% of the city's total developable land. CPAC can be a valuable tool that could potentially be added to the current land value capture toolbox in the US to further help the local government. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I appreciate the invitation to be here. It's good to talk with you. What I would like you to come away with from my talk is this one thought. Land value capture might not be a phrase that you use a great deal, think about a great deal, have heard about a great deal, but I suggest to you that it is simply a phrase that captures a number of concepts that you are familiar with and a number of tools that are currently in existence and in use and legally recognized in the US. These are tools that are available to you now that perhaps can be expanded upon. This is not some odd newfangled idea. It is part of US municipal finance for well over 150 years. Land value capture is part of the system of financing cities. It is not some odd Bolshevik plot. Okay, now if I can work this, all right, let me go back to here. I divide sort of devices for revenue capture into two buckets. One I refer to as voluntary in the way that Julie described some of these, public-private partnerships, community benefits agreements, and development agreements, which she ably described. Then there are mandatory arrangements or non-consensual arrangements, meaning those imposed by the government on the owner. These include special assessments. These can be one-off special assessments where the local legislature just votes to impose a special assessment on a limited district within the town, or it can be through the creation of a special assessment district that has some ongoing life to assess the properties within the area and to continue to operate as such. The next one is what we might generally call incentive zoning. This is where, under the zoning law, an owner is entitled to build to a certain FAR, and the incentive zoning part is that if the owner provides certain kind of public benefits according to the statute, then the owner is entitled to build additional FAR. This might be various kinds of plazas, various subway entrances in urban areas, parks. These can all give the right to build a higher FAR. The next one is, as we saw, impact fees or some kind of exaction that's required from the developer. Again, these are all permissible. These are legally recognized, these mandatory non-consensual approaches. These are permitted. The key is the matter of degree. And while we get valuable insights, inspiration, and models to begin thinking about from different legal systems, just as I've written about the danger of exporting U.S. legal structures to other countries, we have to be careful in selecting other countries' legal structures to import to the U.S. They might not be consistent with the U.S. legal requirements, nor with our history, culture, and economic needs and system. It is often a matter of degree. Whoops, there we go, sorry. This is the guide for us. This is the legal guide that determines what can be done by municipality. It's not merely a thought experiment. Gee, it'd be really cool if we could lower FAR to 1 and then have developers buy back if they want anything above that. Here is the constraint. You see the text there of the Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That's it. Now, there are two kinds of takings. There is an eminent domain taking. That is where it's usually the local legislature, though it could be the executive, but where the local legislature passes legislation that says we're taking the front 10 feet of all the properties down a certain street to widen it. Okay, it is a conscious decision to physically take a certain piece of property in order to widen it to provide a wider lane for car traffic. No problem there. This is a public purpose, and the only fight typically is about the compensation. Great. The second is what we call a regulatory taking, where government does not choose to physically take the property, but government, within its power of regulation, passes a regulation that the owner says, what you regulated in my property has the effect of denying me virtually all use of my property. And this is the area, regulatory takings, that comes out in land value capture. That is the bone of contention, where the owner says, what you did, government, you did not physically take my property, but your regulation, in essence, so deprived me of the value that it is the same. Okay, I'm going to learn how this works. All right, here's the test. You can read it yourself up there. Justice Holmes, some 100 years ago. How do we know if it is a regulatory taking? When the regulation, quote, goes too far. You like that? If there are any engineers there, like your eyes are just rolling back up into your head, thinking about the precision of, God, this is how lawyers work. Well, this is not only how lawyers work, this is how the truly great Justice Holmes' work, if it goes too far. We've been spending 100 years since trying to figure out, does this particular regulation go too far, or does it not go too far? And he recognizes that everything government does, when it says that you can't throw out parts from a slaughterhouse onto your front lawn, when government regulates that, well, that is an imposition on one's property rights. Is that a taking, a regulatory taking? Everything government does, every regulation inhibits property rights. Is that too far? No, okay? Don't worry, gang. That one, no, okay? But the other ones, that's the problem, and we see this a lot in the zoning area, the landmarks area, all of the preservation area. That's when we have questions about going too far. We know it's not absolute. The famous Penn Central case, where the U.S. Supreme Court upheld New York City's right to landmark certain buildings, to hold that the facades could not be altered on these buildings. There could not be adjustments above them. Okay, we'll talk about, though, a bit how they did that. Okay, here's the regulatory taking dynamic. You can read this. This is from a recent case of a more conservative Supreme Court. Okay, the flexibility of the takings doctrine. We know government needs to regulate, but we also know, this court says, we need to protect individuals' right to use their property and from government being over-intrusive. Okay? All right. That's the tension when it goes too far. All right. Now, that was a Supreme Court issue. How does this play out here? We had some cases in the 1980s. The Supreme Court got really quiet for many years on this issue. Nolan and Dolan came in the late 80s. And what they involved a determination by a quasi-adjudicatory body, administrative body, about granting a building permit. And what went on there in the eyes of the owner and ultimately in the eyes of the court was that the government, through this permitting process, was trying to force the owner to give up something that had nothing to do with the problem that the owner was creating with the new building. They were saying, oh, you want that permit to put in a new house? Well, we'll do it, but hand over an easement to us for unrelated purposes. And what the Supreme Court, and like as planners, I don't mean to offend, you might like that, right? You might like, oh, it's a great opportunity. We can get that conservation. It wasn't quite a conservation easement, but like a conservation easement. We can get that conservation easement we've always been wanting. And we can get that easement of access down to the ocean that we've always been wanting. This guy wants a building permit. We say, hey, you got something we got something you want. It's what we call monopoly bargaining. And the Supreme Court says no. There has to be some nexus between the problem caused by what's being built and what's being demanded by government. And there has to be some proportionality. Oh, you want this permit? How about $10 million for it? It's got to somehow work out. Okay, fine. In order to get a physical transfer of land from the owner. The next case came in 2014, the Coons case. Here, government said, oh, you're going to be doing some digging around in this property. It's going to interfere with some of the water issues in the area. We'll let you do it, but give us a big chunk of money that we're going to use. Actually, this one was to create a conservation easement elsewhere to protect. And the court, for the first time, said we're going to apply scrutiny to charging money, not to a fee, an impact fee, not just the exaction of physical land, but an impact fee, and it has to meet the same nexus and proportionality test. Okay, those are our guidelines. But man, they're pretty broad. Goes too far, there has to be a nexus, rough proportionality. This is how litigators put braces on their kids' teeth and send them to college, right? So what do we have? We have the special assessment. I'm just going to go through quickly, sort of roughly applying these. Special assessments are valid. Why? Because as Julie described for us, the people who have to pay the special assessment, part of the non-constitutional law of special assessments, the people who pay the special assessment have to receive a benefit equal to the amount of the special assessment they're paying. And the courts sort of see this even exchange here, and it's okay as a constitutional matter. Incentive zoning. This works, right, where you can buy extra FAR, and here's the difference with the CPAC or with the other examples in South America, France also, where they lower the FAR and then the owner has to buy up. It works in the US only if the starting FAR is high enough to meet the goes too far. I'm a lawyer. I'm going to weasel words this one, right? One FAR is not going to work, okay? Most probably in the US. How many? Got to know your facts, got to know your town, got to know what's going on, etc. But if it's too low, it's not going to be enough basic property right under the tests that we've been talking about. That regulation will go too far. But if it is high enough, then you can do incentive zoning on top of that, if you have as of right enough. Okay, exactions and impact fees, they're okay to prevent the free riders. The city puts in a sewer system, and then somebody wants to build a development that's going to put 1,000 more units flushing into it. They should not get the free ride on the investment that the city put in before, and so it's okay to charge them. Oh, this is more complicated than that, and it looks okay, but there's some problems with that. Okay, incentive zoning, some current examples: public spaces, subway stations, affordable housing. That's a tricky one though, okay? The nexus, we'll talk a little bit more later about that. Okay, I just want to mention New York City, 2017, passed a Midtown East rezoning. Anybody here from New York? Represent. Okay, so they passed this major rezoning, Midtown East. So think roughly on the east side, 5th Avenue to 1st Avenue, 42nd Street, and up 80 blocks. There's maybe like 40 landmark buildings there. It's an aging office stock. And for various reasons, aging office buildings, losing competitive edge, a desire to increase employment, Grand Central's there, St. Pat's Cathedral, Lever House, a whole bunch of places. And so they rezoned it. They increased the minimum FAR from 10 to 15. Here's the biggie. Under the New York City landmarking existing, you could only transfer your excess that you could not build if you were landmarked. If you're landmarked, you can't build as high as you normally could. You could sell that excess, but basically only to an adjacent property. in this new special zone, you could now sell it to anybody within this 80-block zone. So now it was an increased market for it, and here's the value capture. Anthony's saying, where's the value capture, Gerald? Okay, here it is. About 20% of the sales price of these development rights that the landmark building sells, 20% goes to a quasi-governmental board. City reps on there, plus some community people, and they have to invest this money. I mean, there's a lot of details, you know, pages and pages of regs. But they have to invest this money in the area. This is the value capture. Parks, plazas, subway entrances, all that stuff. So the city is sharing out of that extra sale above that the landmark buildings could get. Now, you talk about who can best do this. Do you need a special market in order to make this happen? Do you need government to make this happen? Government has to own these and be a bank. And do you need a special online blockchain set up to make this happen? Markets are really powerful things, right? Within 6 months, JPM, Chase, jumps right into it, and they come out with a proposal. They're going to take down their existing headquarters on Park Avenue in the 50s, take it down, and they're going to go up some 18 floors, build 18 floors higher. How are they doing it? They're buying TDRs from landmark buildings, St. Luke's Church, and some from Grand Central, right? They never were able to build, so Grand Central has a pocket of it right away. And there's another one that's in the works too. I'm out of here.
I gotta say, I was kind of sad when I saw the thank you. I wanted you to keep going. And I was taking notes. So this is a really exciting work. And of course, I'm Mike Alexander. And I'm from Atlanta. I'm going to sound a little Pollyannish tonight. And I apologize for that. If you catch me drinking a beer later, I'll be not Pollyannish, I promise you. But it is an exciting time in Atlanta. It's been a lot of hard work to get to where we are. And so you're going to see a lot of the concepts that have been talked about earlier in pictures and graphics as I get going. So I always start my decks now with this slide. It's a mural. When you're a regional planning agency and you actually have an arts program and you fundraise to do murals, you think you're a cool planner. So this Rise Above is really, really capturing a quote by Martin Luther King about rising above our narrow concerns. And I think that's so critical and important when you think about this work. I know land value capture is very technical, but this is at the heart of good planning in America right now. And I couldn't be happier to be here. I couldn't be happier that APA and the Lincoln Land Institute are doing this work because it's critical for us as planners to have our heads up about this potential. So I'm a regional planner at heart, but I get to watch all this play out in our communities. And really what I've come to understand is this is an ecosystem in Atlanta for us figuring out, by hook or by crook at times, ways to finance infrastructure to get things built in Metro Atlanta. And to show you the scale of this, this is really just the number of community improvement districts that we have in Metro Atlanta. That's a lot. In case you're wondering, that's a lot of community improvement districts. Dan Reuter, quietly in the corner, had a big hand in a lot of these coming into formation. But that's a huge land area where really property owners have made the decision to self-tax themselves to finance infrastructure. And the reason I think we've been so successful is because we immediately transitioned those leverage funds, and some of these CIDs are very small, some of them are some of the biggest really employment centers in the United States. They engage in partnerships with regional planning agencies, state agencies, to take those funds that they're saving and investing in their communities into real projects. So for our CIDs, if you look at any of the reports, they're going to talk about leverage, and leverage is so critical. So really, at the heart of that is these are self-imposed districts, and you can read in detail more about that. You have to have an enabling legislation passed down at the state legislature, and then the local government has to do another bill to allow you to form the CID. So there's some people in Metro Atlanta that are literally experts at forming CIDs, and they have gone door to door figuring this out. So there's a mix of capability and competencies within these CIDs, but it's been a very valuable tool. So just to talk a little bit about that creation, as I've already done, the one thing I wanted to put in these images is to contextualize a place like Cumberland CID, where the new Braves Stadium is. They've been in business for 30 years now. They've really leveraged over $100 million worth of investment in that center for the betterment of that area. One of our newest, Dan worked on this one, the Aerotropolis CID. How many of you have flown into the Atlanta airport? It should be that's my every hand question. You can't not live in America and not come to our airport. The problem with our airport is that most of you, I wish you would leave and go spend more money in our town, but that land around the airport is actually underutilized. And if you look at Europe and the way they maximize the value around their airport, we really spun up these CIDs. So relatively new, but trying to capture this idea of like, how do we incentivize development around the airport to make it as powerful as possible? So that's another model of CID. And then the one on the right, the yards, is really a one parcel CID. And it's an old GM plant right beside a transit station. So you can go, we're old, we're new and big, or you can go down to a single parcel. So we now have a single parcel CID. I could not be prouder of that, right? So the investment model is pretty straightforward. You know, the mill ranges in the state of Georgia from 3 mills to 12 mills. And again, a mill is $1 on 1,000 of value. But the average across all the CIDs is about 4.7 mils. And again, this is all self-imposed, right? And so the good example of this, if you've been to downtown, we've rebuilt one of our streetcars, and the CID in downtown Atlanta actually helped fund that. That's how powerful the CID property taxes are, that they were able to leverage those funds to do an actual transit project. Shows you the scale of that. Now, the reality is that was a big investment for them, and that's going to be a long-term investment for them. So they are critically focused on how that's impacting the land use around that line. Now, the reality is on a Friday night, the hottest district in Metro Atlanta is along that line on Edgewood Avenue. So if you want to go to a place like Joystick and play video games in a bar setting, it is a very, very fun place to be on Friday night. I'm a little too old for that now, but it's a great change in the land use intensity based on investments like that, right? So tax allocation districts, you say TIF, I say TAD. TADs in Georgia are also popular, and you've heard a lot about this tax increment financing already. Our biggest and best example is Atlantic Station, right? And so if you look at the photo on the left, it really was a steel mill. It really was a functioning steel mill that went out. So there was a lot of environmental concerns about this. And so when this was really proposed, it was novel. A lot of people thought that it wouldn't work. There was just all those environmental concerns associated with a steel mill. They ended up capping a lot of that with concrete. And now, as you can see, it has filled in quite nicely. And the value capture here is just really incredible. That property wasn't generating any real value. And so, you know, the public investment's about $253 million. The private investment on that project now is over $1.6 billion. So a core property in our core that was blighted that we've completely turned around in Metro Atlanta. So TADs actually work. The surprising thing is it's been so popular in Georgia. There are over 60 TADs now across the state in places that you might not otherwise think about. So this is a map of all the TADs in the city of Atlanta. You can see the city of Atlanta has been all in on using tax allocation districts. Of course, if you weren't aware, we had a terrible recession, and of course, you heard really one of the problems with this is misestimating the potential revenue. Those properties fell off. The good thing is the city was relatively conservative about allocating their tax allocation district dollars. So much, all of these districts had pots of money. They didn't overextend themselves. So we were in relatively good shape coming out of the recession, and it has started to pay off. So how many of you have been on the Beltline? Come on, you're planners. See, that's a good number. So wrapping around the Beltline is a lot of tax allocation district investment. The old 4th Ward Park, which is really the world's largest park detention pond, I think, built in the last 20 years. But that is a park that's designed to flood. It's stormwater retention control. But tax allocation district funding was used to help build that park. And if you've walked that area of the Beltline, you know there are a few places in the United States that have had the level of investment as that area has had. So you put the Beltline together with tax allocation district financing, you build a park, and then you take a city eyesore like City Hall East, which is now Ponce City Market, that I can tell you from economic development terms, you do not want to compete against us when we bring in companies and they see Ponce City Market, they go, holy cow, right? And so it's really, really been a boon for our economic development officials to be able to take them to the top of Ponce City Market and play putt-putt and look out over the Beltline. It's good work that has gone on with these tax allocation districts. Now, another one that may surprise you is actually Standard Strip Shopping Mall. This is out in Gwinnett County, one of our suburban counties in Duluth. Duluth has a tax allocation district. It's a relatively small city. They've used that tax allocation district funding model to incentivize a multifamily development, and doing what we've gotten more comfortable in doing is helping developers to provide structured parking through that type of financing. So again, you'll see this public-private partnership that leads to things like parking for development with the incentives of affordable housing baked into the multifamily development. And that's how we like to do things in Metro Atlanta. So the other program that I want to talk about real quickly is a program of the Atlanta Regional Commission, our Livable Centers Initiative, because it brings it all back together. If you think of value capture and you're willing to entertain a broad definition of what that actually means, then this program is the program we're most proud of. And it's really started to get even more focused on our transit-oriented development district areas in Metro Atlanta. So real quickly, this is the MARTA station system as it stands today. So we've been planning for these areas for a very long time, and there's just now getting the development pressure in areas that truthfully had been passed by again and again and again for development. So the key bullet on this is gap funding, right? So how do you incentivize development at these MARTA stations? MARTA owns the property, but it's still really hard to make the numbers work, especially in fast-growing areas where there's a lot of development pressure to be at market rate, because like most other places, we're really struggling to figure out affordable housing. I think this is the #1 issue in the United States, and it's come up in such a short period of time. We were in a recession. I was making all these maps about underwater houses, and now I've got a whole decks about how certain areas of Atlanta aren't affordable. So a massive change in a relatively short period of time. So we recognize these TOD areas combined with special financing, and if we can layer all of this together, we can do some pretty special work. So we incentivize these planning studies. This is a nationally recognized program. So federal transportation dollars get put into studies. It's like you're going, your grandparents have decided to pay for your college, except they're telling you what to major in, which is more walkable communities, more human-centric planning. So that's the way we focus this work. But the big incentive is that our board agreed to fund implementation dollars of up to $500 million, $500 million in additional investment if these communities implement these LCI studies, right? So the case study for us is Avondale Station. Full disclosure, I live in the city of Decatur. This is actually in the city of Decatur, a half mile from my house. So I get to look at it all the time, right? And so this is what it looks like today, a parking lot. And we started this in 2002, And of course, the big point here is it takes a long time. You have to have real patience to stay with this kind of work. We funded some improvements. They got deauthorized. Then the city of Decatur really got interested in it. And so we went out to RFP for design development, and this ended up being the final design for this project, right? But what we've done, and you can see those funding numbers, is we have put money into this redevelopment, federal transportation dollars into this development. This is the gap funding. So I made this slide. This is my favorite slide. Isn't that pretty? Isn't that great to look at? I made our staff go find the letters so that I could take pictures on my phone of like how you write a letter to get GDOT to transfer federal highway money over to FTA accounts so that that can become FTA money. And when it becomes FTA money, then we can do different things like funding improvement at transit stations, right? So think Ozark for a second, except all completely legal, right? And so this is one of the things that we have done. And so that allowed us to do bus improvement at the station itself and actually build parking spaces. Now, we've talked a lot about how mobility is changing. Parking spaces is what we can fund right now. I hope the funding buckets change over time. But we've built a lot of parking there, and that has created space for the developer to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, which is increase the share of affordable housing. There's a big senior housing project at this MARTA station, which we could not be more tickled about. So this is the development inventory and funding structure associated with that. And I don't have enough time to go into this in detail, but the big thing to know is that we're making the station better, and because we're able to build that parking, it offsets costs for the developer. And that's about as high end as it gets. At the groundbreaking, actually, the FTA administrator for this region came down and said, and FTA has put this money into this project. And of course, all the staff planners were in the back, well, that was federal highway funds originally. So it's a good partnership by everybody, including our state agencies that help us figure this type of mechanical work out to help our communities in ways that really incentivize great places, right? So here it is under construction. Look at the size of the parking deck. I know we're all planners in here. So I'm calling the MARTA people. I'm like, I need a picture that doesn't show the deck because the deck looks taller than the building, which I'm not sure about at this point. But if you're down at street level, I promise you it's going to be amazing. Like street level retail, it's going to look beautiful. So, and you can see the crossing over to the MARTA station. We couldn't be doing TOD more perfect. When this is built, if y'all text me or call me, I'll take you down there and we'll check it out. So I can't wait for this one to finish up. But it really is just to illustrate the number of partnerships it takes to do this work in reality, right? Commitments by so many different types of organizations to figure it out. And it really is the public sector and the private sector working together, which is really at the heart of what CIDs and TADs and all these funding mechanisms are about. They're there to create a money framework where people can work together. So again, I know I sound Pollyannish, but things are really great in Atlanta, and I can't wait for all this stuff to get built. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll get this conversation started. Let's get after it, as Chris Cuomo might say. I'm going to ask one question each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up really quickly. But Jerry, I wanted to start with you. You have really educated us on your review of property rights jurisprudence. One thing that caught my attention was making reference to throwing out stuff from a slaughterhouse in front of your property. So we can say with certainty that if it involves entrails, it's okay in terms of government regulation. Is that a brighter line we can perhaps consider?
If it's part of a religious practice, maybe it's protected. I'm not sure. So.
Ah, yes. No, RLUIPA might come into that. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
No
wonder they hate lawyers.
Lawyers.
Started.
The last challenge, or one of the most recent challenges to inclusionary housing was, of course, the San Jose case, which didn't advance. And we don't want to make this seem like it's hard or scary or difficult, but if you had to advise planners and local officials how what can they do proactively to anticipate a legal challenge to this concept?
So, and I'll be brief. The California Supreme Court upheld inclusionary zoning against a challenge by, it was State Builders Association. And so a requirement that 15%, I think it was, of the units in any new building had to be for lower income, and this was for sale to lower income. They upheld it, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take the case. And there's a concern that it will come back to the Supreme Court, and whatever happens this Thursday in Washington and thereafter, you can be confident that a new member of the Supreme Court will be more protective of property rights and shift that balance that way. The issue is that this was a legislative requirement, and up until now, the court has usually deferred to legislative requirements, legislative exactions, essentially, or legislative impact fees. They've only gotten upset when it's been these administrative bodies on the one-offs. For your permit, you have to give us this. But if it's been a legislative scheme that sets it out, they've generally deferred to it, separation of powers, etc. Some concern that they might not be so deferential anymore. And then there's the question of nexus. Does the building of a market building really relate to a lack of affordability? The lack of affordable housing, we know, is not just a societal problem, it's a societal disgrace. I mentioned I'm from New York. It's not an abstract issue in New York. It's one that we see on our streets literally daily. It is I think, a threat sort of to the fabric of our society, and it's an economic threat, I think, as well, not just to those least able to pay in our society, but to those people who are coming into our marketplace, young college grads. It's not affordable for them. But I think for people can only proceed as they've done before. This is one where we'll have to wait to see what the court finds. It is possible that they will get involved and not defer, and it is possible the California court's position was this is not a taking of property, this just makes their property less valuable. And that is not particularly compelling. I think ultimately the challenge for affordable housing is, do we believe that's a problem? Then all of us ought to pay for it. But that's a policy decision and an electoral decision that hopefully happens in my lifetime. I get to keep this.
Thank you. Julie, my next question is for you. The word is in Sao Paulo that landowners and developers actually greeted this new regime with CPACs they responded well. They liked the consistency of the permitting process and the development process. So at first glance, you might look at it and say, well, they're starting with an FAR of 1. It must have driven everyone crazy. But the response by the development community was more positive. I guess my question is, do you have a sense for how the development community might respond to some of these land value capture mechanisms?
So as I mentioned, in general, the benefits of CPACs are that, as you said, it provides transparency. It also provides a market-based approach in determining the value of incremental density. And more importantly, it can also provide the improvements early on, regardless. But one of the key questions, if we were to apply here, is the regulatory takings issue, as Jerry mentioned. So if the key question is who actually owns the air right above the as-right zoning? It's if it's owned by private owner, and so if the private owners are the ones who actually buy CPACs, then the regulatory takings issue is no different than impact fees. So it's essentially the same. So they found that in Sao Paulo, the private property owners actually benefited from CPACs, whether they participated in CPAC program or not, because the land value appreciation was much higher for those areas that actually implement CPACs as opposed to that did not. In part because the public improvements were made early on to really trigger land appreciation, but they also chose to issue in those areas where there was high demand. So we didn't have the issues of the issues that you talked about. From a developer standpoint, if we were to actually implement it here in the US, it actually provides more options for them over and beyond exactions and development agreement. So, for example, CPACs will provide access to additional capital investment pool, so that they can actually spread out their financial burden, especially in the early phases when their risk is very, very high. In addition, CPAC also provided vested right in the sense that when you buy it, essentially it guarantees that there's no change in land use and zoning. So it really, for them, was a very valuable instrument. Plus, it also allowed them to kind of wait out down cycles if the real estate market was really bad. So that was another benefit. But overall, I believe the most useful area where CPAC could be applied is publicly owned land, where you don't have the regulatory takings issue. So right now, you kind of provide land use entitlements in a very ad hoc basis, but this could probably provide a more market-based, transparent way of monetizing land entitlements, which is actually a very, very valuable asset that's under the control of the local governments.
So a little bit of that win-win dynamic in place, and also more predictable, it sounds like. Michael, finally to you, and then we're going to open things up and not invade the reception time. Very important not to do that. Thinking about Atlanta, red hot Atlanta, in some of the equivalent of community investment districts or community improvement districts, there's been some concern about whether government is unwittingly or otherwise spurring gentrification, that issues of race and equity are not being considered sufficiently. Can you elaborate on some of the ways that planners there are making sure that these financing mechanisms are configured to bring about more equity?
Yeah, I think most directly in our work, we've worked with MARTA, which is obviously the transit agency for Metro Atlanta. It is absolutely an imperative for us to get that right. I think that fear is very real in high opportunity areas as we see this transition. I mean, we have been working on this very hard in the west side with the new football stadium in particular, and just being honest, you know, that community has had so many plans done. So many people have gone into the west side of Atlanta and told them what they need to do instead of really listening to them and figuring it out. This time, I think they've done real work as one of the best examples. In fact, they have funded a program that basically pays for all the existing owners over, I think, the age of 60s property taxes. Because they realized there really weren't that many people left who were owner-occupied living in their home, and it was just easier to literally pay their property taxes so that they would be under no pressure to move out. That's just one example of a pretty unique way that we're trying to address this. It's a relatively small solution. The other thing that we've done that I'm really excited about is we started an equitable transit-oriented development program with our core partners. Now that's a terrible planner name. Like the LCI program, Livable Center, that used to be called ACTIPS. So we had ETOD. Now that's called the Transformation Alliance. And the whole point of this program is to get everybody in the room to work on making sure no one is displaced as these transit-oriented districts really do start to develop. And there's been a great partnership. Because of that partnership, we were selected as a Spark community, and that allows us to have access to $90 million in additional capital to try to make sure that we're building programs to help people stay in their communities. So the Transformation Alliance, which we backbone at the ARC, is our critical program that we're using right now to bring everyone into the room to work on this, to make sure that everybody is really heard and thought about before this happens. So very real concern.
All right, terrific. So now let's open it up. It's going to have to be kind of lightning round style. So I leave it to all of you to come up with crisp, targeted questions on the subject of value capture. So who wants to go first? A little lightning round just to bring things to a close. Any questions, lingering thoughts? Yes, please. All right, so idea that value capture works better in a hot market. If we look at a regenerating post-industrial legacy city, is there some way to sort of wade into the water? And any thoughts from?
Maybe I can answer that to start. I mean, typically, you know, the public improvements are market-driven as well. So on the down market, when there are not of new developments, you really don't need public improvements, right? So these rent value capture methods are used when there is a lot of improvement that's needed with new development and expansions and things like that. But in general, you know, I mean, essentially under down market, you want to have a lease imposition on property owners and taxpayers. So, you know, property tax and tax increment financing, there's no new tax rate involved. So essentially, you pay the same tax amount, but you're essentially leveraging the future tax revenue upfront. So there would be maybe most least imposing would be my thought.
I think our experience is it's very ad hoc. Atlantic Station is a good example of a property that was vacant for a very long period of time. A hot market Atlanta is, but there are big areas of Metro Atlanta that are still underwater. I mean, we have basically big areas of the southern part of our region where the housing markets still aren't functioning 10 years after the start of the recession. And it's very much a struggle in those communities. In the city of Atlanta, one of the properties that's in the news right now is the Gulch. And there's a lot of political energy around a potential TAD financing scheme for that property. And that property's been vacant for 50 years. It's the most intractable planning problem, and now there's a real developer there, but we're hearing the classic stuff. That area, as far as the office market goes, you would think it's been booming, but it's been one of our least attractive places for new development. So that a developer wants to come into that area, you would think would be well received. There are a lot of questions about that development, and the classic stuff about developers making money are being said a lot, which is challenging for someone who's watched that property my whole career. to know. But the only financing mechanism that seems to make the toughest property in the core likely for development is, a TIF, a TAD financing scheme.
All right, yes, please.
Just curious of how value capturing plays a role in planning for the aging community. I don't know if you spent any time talking about how boomers are retiring at the same rate as millennials are obtaining full-time employment, and how there's going to be a huge shift by 2025. And we're increasing rental rates and saturating the market with more apartments, but it seems that we're not really thinking about retirement living communities or efforts to age in place or transition retirees into, I don't know what that community looks like. I mean, in terms of today, walkable, healthy, viable communities. I feel like we haven't spent much time talking about it.
Well, and certainly in terms of those aging, graying boomers, and I'm exempting all of us from that category, of course.
Gen X.
The good news is that that is one part of the market that the real estate development community is recognized as, it's a wellspring. So these mixed use and residential areas like Hudson Yards, I think, is probably, they have that kind of demographic very much in mind. But
the question, I think, is important because the need for municipal resources is not just to repair existing roads and bridges, et cetera, but it's to build the infrastructure that's needed going forward. And that might be for the aging community. It also is to bring in the fiber optic systems to make the cities competitive, to draw people and to make them competitive within the country, but also globally. So the needs are changing and the infrastructure needs are changing. And you highlight one which I don't know that a lot of people are focusing on when they're talking about infrastructure, but it is indeed an important one and a new one, not just fixing the bridges that we're seeing falling apart.
And that takes us back to infrastructure, where we started, and new ways of financing infrastructure and supporting our cities. So we've got to get to that reception. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. And I know I'll be around for the reception. Please come up and talk to us one-on-one, and good luck to you with the rest of your gathering.